What is up, guys? Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to lower my wife's 2009 Tahoe. Now if you cut a couple videos back, I have done a few things to it, but today we're going to show you the process of how I lowered it. Now it is a four-wheel drive, so some people are probably sitting here thinking, why would you lower four-wheel drive? Well, we don't really go off-road in it, and it looks way better. It's easier for my wife to get in and out of. So the process is pretty much the same for two-wheel or four-wheel drive, so it doesn't matter which one you have. You just don't have to deal with the axles in the front if you have a two-wheel drive. This will work on 2007 to 2013 Tahoe Yukon Escalade. So if you have any of those models, this process is pretty much the same. The other thing is you do need to do the free travel mod. So I did a video before this, and I'll link it down below, of the free travel mod. Anytime you're going more than 3 inches, I say, some people say 4 inches, but at the 3-inch mark or lower, you really need to cut off those bump stops in the back and the bracketry, which you'll see in that video what to do. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward process, and I will post at the end some pictures of the completed process. Let's get started. Alright, so the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to jack the back of the truck up. We're going to support it right in front of the axle on the frame. Make sure you chock your front wheels so the car doesn't roll. Obviously, when you get the front off the ground, sometimes it wants to roll. And let's get started. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where the auto ride sensor's at. Now I still have the rear end supported where I lifted it up. I'm not on the jack stand yet, so this is actually where the suspension sets. I'm going to mark it here, and the reason I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to do away with the auto ride system. I'm going to bypass it. If you want to continue to use the auto ride system, you need to mark this because you need to know where it needs to be at ride height, and you're going to have to get a shorter rod here. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and mark that so I know where to place it if it moves, so it's not constantly trying to put air in something that's not there. Alright, so my next step, once I've got the auto ride unhooked, I'm going to use a pick to open this up and give us a little more room of travel, but I'm going to take off the sway bar end link. So you can, once you take these off, it's an 18mm. If the center starts to spin, you're going to need a 6mm for the center to keep it from spinning, and you need to remove these on both sides. So, and then you can just set these aside because we have new end links in the kit, so we'll get those off. Alright, so our next step, once we get the sway bar end links off, which you see I've got them off, we need a 21mm to take the shock off. So this is an auto ride car. If you don't have an auto ride car, you don't have to mess with this, but you do have to take this little rubber or this metal clip out, and then you do have to unplug the shock at the top. Now how I'm going to bypass that is I bought some pieces off eBay to solder in. All it is a resistor, but take the 21mm out of the top. Sometimes it's easier if you get this out of the way, which are just 7mm. I think I can sneak it out without doing that, but go ahead and take the shock out. Alright, so now that we got the shock out of the way and everything's unhooked there, we're ready to drop the rear end out and take the springs out. So I haven't let it down on the jack stands yet. I mean, they're up against the frame, but what we're going to do is we're going to gradually lower it while the jack stands are in place. Make sure you've got jack stands up there. Gradually lower it, and the springs will come loose, and you'll be able to pull those out, and then we'll get ready to put the new ones back in. Alright, for the spring in the back, guys, I'm actually using a Trailblazer spring, 4230 by Beltec, and just gives a little bit better ride. Same size spring, gives you about a 4 to 5 inch drop in the back. Now some people complain about this settling, giving them a little too much drop in the back. I will say that if you have a rear seat or any kind of stereo in the back, it does seem to ride a little lower than 4 inches, closer to 5. So what I've done is Beltec makes a spacer, a 1-inch spacer, 3523, that I'm going to put in if I don't like the look of it, or if it's got kind of a Cali lean in the back. I really don't want it to be lower in the back, so I'm going to put them in without it for now. But kind of how this works is we're going to take those rubber isolators off the bottom of the stock springs, put them on the bottom, and that just keeps the spring from making noise. And we're ready to kind of put these back in. So if you're going to haul something, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some helper bags that go in the springs. Right now I'm not going to put those in. I will list down below what you need in order to do that. So let's get these new springs in. Alright, so our next step is to install this DJM hardware kit. So it's RK2007. I'll list it in the links down below, but this is kind of what comes with it. So what it does is it relocates your sway bar, which you can see the shorter sway bar links. It relocates the lower control arm, and it also relocates the shock. So, and it comes with all the hardware that you need. The next step on the vehicle is we're going to release this lower control arm, which is a 21 millimeter. Now I'd recommend that you only do this one side at a time, just so the rear end doesn't get out of whack. But we're going to go ahead and take the 21 millimeter out. Once I get that out of the way, I'm going to put that bump stop in. It goes in this hole here. Now that's something that I bought separate. You can use just about any bump stop, so we're going to put that in as well. Alright, so before I tighten it up, I wanted to give you guys a look at it. So that's the bump stop that I put in. Like I said, you need the control arm out of the way so you can reach up in there and tighten that up. And then this is the relocation for the lower control arm. There's a bolt in the center, and then 2 coming in from the outside on each side at the top. And then all we'll do is put our lower control arm back in the bottom when we're finished. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten this up, and then we'll go to the other side. Alright, so we've got the relocation brackets put in. Everything's tightened up here. You just need to snug these. Don't get real crazy. Don't use an impact. And so if you look, we're quite a ways off from hooking up the lower control arm. Now you are going to have to use their new bolt because the factory bolt does not have enough threading on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a ratchet strap just to gradually pull the front end closer in order to get me lined up so I can thread that in and tighten it up. So that's our next step. Alright, I wanted to show you guys where I ratchet strapped. I just picked a spot on the frame and then put it on the shock mount on the back and pulled the rear end. The rear end wants to roll back when it's loose, so pulled the rear end back in place, and then I was able to get the bolt back in. So now we're going to tighten it up. And we're just going to snug that because it really needs to be tightened with the load on the suspension. Alright, so now that we got the lower control arm bolt in, we're going to move on to relocating the sway bar. So the sway bar actually has to come over a little bit in order for clearance with the new drop. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these 10 millimeter bolts out on both sides, this D bushing, and we're going to move it over, and we're going to drill new holes about 1 inch over. And so once I get those holes drilled, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. The kit comes with new bolts in order to bolt it down. So we're going to take those loose. I'm actually going to take it loose on both sides. It makes it easier to swing. Just loose on that side, completely off on this side. Alright, so this is with this unhooked, and I went ahead and marked it and moved it over 1 inch. Now if you notice, I also brought it back towards the back of the car, kind of the instructions, that's the way it looks. So we've got our 2 3/8" holes drilled. So now we can hook this back up and slide it over, and then we can begin to put the actual end links together. Alright, so I have the end links put in, and they are different. So the more angled one goes on the passenger side. This is the driver's side, and I'll show you on the passenger side the difference. As you can see, that one has quite a bit more angle, but one of the things I did have to take out of the way in order to get the sway bar to set right was this bracket. It's a 13mm bolt, and so I just had to do that in order to get the sway bar up where it needed to be. Now I can go ahead and put it back where it was at, and then we're going to move on to the shock extensions. Alright, so I got everything tightened up other than the lower control arm bolt, which, like I said, needs to have the suspension loaded, but went ahead and tightened up the D-ring bushing that we moved, tightened up both sides of the end links, and now we're moving on to the sway bar, or I'm sorry, the shock relocator. And it's pretty self-explanatory. There's not a side, they're both the exact same. This slides up in place like that. There is a threaded insert that goes on the top side here that you'll be able to thread a bolt up through, and then it comes with 2 bolts to bolt those 2 sides on. You're going to use your stock shock bolt on the bottom side. So I'll get that installed on both sides, and then we'll move to putting the shock on. Alright, so now we're ready to put the rear shocks on. We got everything tightened up on the relocation for the shocks. The shock that I chose to use is the Street Performance. It's 2410FF, and I'll list that below as well. If you order the whole kit, it's $95.05, but if you order these separate, this is the strut or shock that you're going to use. So the other thing I haven't addressed, of course we're going to use the stock bolts to put those back into place, but the other thing I haven't addressed is the stock air ride or auto ride. So I ordered some pieces off eBay. All I have to do is cut this pigtail off. Now I'm going to cut it off with enough room in case I decide to go back to stock that I can solder these back on. I'm just going to plug this just to keep dirt and debris out of it. And then for the front, I'm just going to tie this up to where it's level like I marked to begin with. That way it doesn't kick on the compressor all the time. So I'm going to go ahead and put the struts on, or the shocks on in the rear now, and probably set it down, tighten up this lower control arm bracket, and move on to the front. Alright, so I wanted to show you guys what I did. I actually just put a couple zip ties around that to line it up to where it was before. And in the back, like I said, I just taped this up so I didn't have any issues with stuff getting in it. I'm pretty sure I won't ever go back to the auto ride setup, but anyway, I'm still waiting on these to come in. All you have to do is cut these off, solder the new ones on. Like I said, leave yourself enough room in case you decide to go back later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and put the wheel back on, tighten up the bottom of the shock and the lower control arm, and then set it down, and then I'm going to start on the front. So, but don't forget to do those things. Don't forget to tighten up the stuff in the back. Don't forget to bypass this. If you have it, if you don't, then that's awesome. You can skip this step altogether. Alright, so now we got the back down. We've moved to the front. So same thing, chalk your back wheels, lift the front up, get some sort of jack stand on both sides to support the frame, and then go ahead and spray some like WD-40 on the sway bar, the bottom of the struts, the upper ball joint, the lower ball joint, the tie rod end, and then I'm going to go ahead and first thing I'm going to do is take this 10mm bolt out that holds the ABS line. I'm going to pop that loose up top to get it out of the way, and then I'm going to take the sway bar out, which is a 15mm, the sway bar end link anyway, and then we'll move on to the brake assembly, taking it off next. Alright, so I got those out of the way. I went ahead and took the 2 15mm bolts out of the strut, the bottom of the strut as well, while I was down there. It's 15. And now we need to take the brake off. So to take the brake off, there's a 19mm on the top side, and then the bracket itself is an 18mm. So you need to take both those off, and then you need to suspend the brake caliper over here. Don't let it just hang by the line. Use a bungee cord or something to hold it up out of the way. And then once we get the brake off, we're going to move on to the center hub assembly. So we'll go ahead and knock this off and then we'll go from there. Alright, so once we have the caliper off and suspended out of the way, we're going to need to take this bolt out of the center of the rotor. That's a T30 bit. And take that out, take the rotor out of the way, and then we're going to bust this guy loose, and I'll show you what we're going to need for that. Alright, so to get the center out, you're going to need a 36 millimeter. Now, I own one of these, but they do rent them at the tool rental, your local hardware store or parts store. So you're going to need an impact for this. If you don't have an impact, the other way you can do it is you can put the wheel on, take the center cap off, and loosen it that way before you start dismantling all this. But the best way is to take it off with an impact, so we'll get that out of the way. Alright, so now we got that 36 millimeter nut out of the way. We need to take, there's 3 15 millimeter bolts that hold the hub assembly together. We need to take those all out, so we're going to go ahead and do that now. And then we'll pull the hub assembly out. Make sure that you keep in mind when you're putting it back together which way it's oriented. So pull it out, set it aside, and we'll keep going. Alright, so now that that's out of the way, we're going to move on to taking the axle out. So all that is there's some 15 millimeter bolts. There's 6 of them up top. You can do this without taking this apart. I've just found it's a lot easier to put it back together with that apart. So there's only 6 of them. Take those out on both sides, get the axle out of the way, and it just makes things a lot easier when you're going back together. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and take the strut assembly out of the way. There's 3 18 millimeter bolts on the top side. I like to use a ratcheting wrench and do it from here. You can also pop the hood and get to them. If you have auto ride, there is a clip that you need to undo and get that out of the way. And then sometimes there's keepers that keep some of the wire loom out of the way that are stuck to the top. Just pop those off and then take these 3 18 millimeter bolts out, and we've already loosened the bottom ones and taken them out, so then you'll be able to get the strut completely out of the way. Alright, so our next step after we get the strut out of the way, the axles out of the way, we need to undo the ball joints. So upper ball joint's an 18 millimeter. Bottom one has been replaced on mine. It is a 27 millimeter, and then 21 millimeter on the tie rod end. So we need to undo all of these. I recommend using an impact just so they don't spin. It gets them off quickly. So we're going to take those off, and then we'll be able to get, a lot of times you'll have to strike the side of that with a hammer. Don't hit the end, don't hit the threaded end on any of these to get that loose. Make sure you hit the side of the spindle itself in order to knock those loose if they don't come loose. You'll end up boogering up the threads if you don't do that. So then we'll put the new spindle on, and I'll show you that assembly. Alright, so now we have the old spindle beside the new spindle. As you can see, the new spindle moves the hub assembly up 2 inches, and that's where your drop comes from. So I went with 2511 is the part number on the spindles, and the reason I went with that is it's meant for a 3-inch drop or more. So obviously I'm going to do drop struts as well, so this helps to get it back in alignment. That's the way these are made. So there's a couple different part numbers. If you're only doing 2-inch, you don't want to do the 2511 spindle, but if you're doing more than 3 inches or more, this is the spindle that you want to use. Now on their website it shows it only works on a 2-wheel drive. The box even says 2 and 4-wheel drive, so don't worry about that. That is our next step, is to put that on. Alright, so you get the spindle on. Before you tighten up the upper ball joint, you need to take one of your hub assembly bolts and go ahead and thread it in. And the reason being is because it's not going to fit. You won't be able to get it in once you tighten that bolt. So, or the bottom or the top ball joint. So make sure you go ahead and thread that in before you put everything together. And then we're going to move on to installing the struts. Alright, so one other quick thing before I move on to the strut is you do need to go ahead and torque the top. You don't have to torque the bottom. I went ahead and torqued the top and the bottom. Now I've left the tie rod end loose because I need some play in this in order to get the axle back in. So
I'm going to hook that up last, but this top gets torqued to 37 pound-feet. The bottom gets 92 pound-feet. And the bottom has cotter keys. The top one does not. So another thing that you need to do is, if you're four-wheel drive, which I'm guessing that you are if you're watching this, you need to cut this off flush. And the reason being is it's going to drag across the boot of the axle. So if you don't do that, you're going to rub a hole in the axle. So make sure that you trim this off. I like to cut mine maybe with one thread left. Sometimes I cut it even. It just needs to be out of the way. So we're going to go ahead and cut that off real quick. Alright, so moving on to the strut, obviously we have to compress the spring in order to get that off, and I'm going to put the spring compressors on here in just a second, but we do need to take this valve off the top. All it is a quick disconnect, 18 millimeter, and that'll come right off, and then we'll be able to compress the strut and spring assembly and get the old spring out of the way. Alright, so I have the strut spring compressors on, and I like to leave a little bit of pressure on them. I like to see the spring pull up a little bit, and then maybe back it off a little bit. And the reason I do that is that generally these top bolts are pretty rusty because they catch rain and dirt, and so it makes it a little bit easier when it has some of that pressure of the spring to help release it. But I'm going to go ahead and take this off, and then I'll show you the reassembly process on the new drop strut. Alright, so the new strut assembly comes with, you know, several different options. You can lift it 2 inches, you can drop it up to 2 inches. So with the strut and the drop spindle, you could go as much as 4 inches. So what I've chosen to do is do a 3.5 in the front. So that's going to be a 2 inch on the spindle and then 1.5 inches on the strut. So what I'm going to do is put one ring on, and that basically moves it from, it's right in the middle of 2 inches and 1 inch. So that's where I'm going to be. Just depending on the desired drop that you want, will determine how many rings you put on or take off, and that can always be changed. So if you get it together and you don't like it, you can always take it back apart. But that's what I'm going to start with. Then these two things go on after the spring cup. The spring cup goes on, and then your this is kind of to keep dirt and debris out of the strut itself, and then the bump stop. So then we're going to put it all back together, trying to keep it like the old one was taken apart. And what I mean by that is the spring, I'll show you on the other side. You can see how it's lined up. The middle of the spring is lined up facing out, so that's the way you want to reassemble it in that same manner. The other thing you want to do is make sure that the top piece is lined up. It's marked. You can see the marks from the factory, so make sure that you line that up the same way. These are offset a little bit, so if you get it wrong, it won't want to go in the correct way. So this facing out and these lined up, and we're ready to tighten down this center bolt, put everything back together, and put it back in the truck. Alright, so we got the strut together, and I set it up in here, and I just put one bolt in it. And the reason I do that is you don't want to tighten that because you need some movement back and forth in order to get the axle back in. So I went ahead and put the axle back in. I just hand tightened the 6 bolts that we took out and threaded this through for now. And now I'm going to put the hub assembly on. Notice I went ahead and put the 15 millimeter, the 3 15 millimeter bolts that hold the hub assembly in. And so now I'm going to put the hub assembly on, and then we'll be able to move on to tightening that and then getting the strut into place. But you do need the strut a little loose in order to move it around enough to clear the axle for now. Don't worry about it. It's going to be underneath that once we're all seated. So it looks like it's going to interfere right now, but it's not. So alright, so now we got the hub assembly back on. The bolts behind the hub assembly torque to 133 foot-pounds, so the 3 bolts that hold the hub assembly together, 133 foot-pounds of torque. So now I'm going to go ahead and put I've got one of the nuts holding the top together. Going to go ahead and put those on and start to snug those down, and I'm going to put the bottom side of this up on the channel that it belongs, the bottom side of the strut. So sometimes you have to press this down while you're pushing up on the strut in order to get it in place. and then going to go ahead and put the brake rotor back on and caliper assembly. And after that, I'll talk about what we're going to torque the axle flange nuts to. Alright, so I got the brake caliper bracket and the rotor back on. So it's time to torque a few things down. So earlier I already said I torqued down the upper and lower ball joints. But for the top of the shock or strut, it's 37 pound-feet. The bottom is 37 pound-feet. The tie rod, which I'm going to now hook up, will be 37 pound-feet. The axle flange, where I took out the 6 bolts that hold the axle in the center here, those actually are 58 pound-feet. The nut that goes on the end here is 177 pound-feet, which generally I do that last once I get it on the ground, so the wheel doesn't want to spin, doesn't want to roll around. And then for the brakes, the actual brake bracket itself is 148, and then the guide pin bolts that hold the caliper on are 74. So the only thing I have left after that will be to put in the stabilizer or the sway bar end links, and those are 17 pound-feet. So I just really crunch those down until they're, it looks like they're snug, where you can't spin the center, is generally when I quit on those. But 17 pound-feet is what GM recommends. So we'll finish this up. Alright, everything's tightened up, torqued down. The last thing that I did is to bypass the auto ride. You can buy these on eBay. It's basically just a resistor that goes in line, so you cut the plug off. Now I did keep the plug, I cut it back enough where I could keep it if I decided to go back to the stock setup. But other than that, I've got to put those in the back. I showed you earlier that I didn't have them yet. So I've got to jack up the back and put the same thing in the back. I'm going to go ahead and unplug the compressor for the auto level while I'm back there. But the next picture you guys see, I got to put the wheel on a course, drop it down, will be of it completed.